Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and today I'm speaking to you, as I usually do, from the studios of a community TV station here in Tucson, Arizona. This is important for a number of reasons, because the story I am going to tell you could not be told in any other venue except on YouTube, where it is basically placed. But in mass media, if it were not for community TV, this story would never be seen the light of day, which it first did. Now, there's a movie coming out quite soon. I think today is the first day of August, 2014. I just saw the trailer for a movie called Gary Webb. And I'm familiar with the story, and I don't know if you are. But in 1996, Gary Webb, as a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, published a series of articles in which, substantiated by thousands of pages of articles on the website, was a story accusing the CIA in complicity of selling drugs in the ghettos of Los Angeles and recycling that money back into the Contras, the Nicaraguans, and the CIA. The San Jose Mercury News is not a small newspaper. Now, I was aware of the CIA and their history with drugs from my own work. I had majored in East Asian Studies, University of California, Davis. I was familiar that after World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's forces, the renegade of them, had ended up in the Burma Triangle and proceeded to make quite a good living processing opium into heroin and selling it through the CIA. Later on, I also was aware of a bank called the Nguyen Han Bank out of Australia, which is a CIA front for the U.S. military in laundering millions of dollars of opium trade, heroin trade in the Southeast Asia. So when in 1996 Gary Webb published this, it was surprising for only one reason: that the source of the material was the U.S. media. Now, what happened was very curious. Because of Webb's insistence that they do so, the San Jose Mercury News uploaded the data, the corroborating data that he used for a story, onto their website. This is what happened. Webb feared that unless the data were uploaded to the site, that he would be discredited by government claims of lack of evidence. His series of stories called Dark Alliance received national attention. At the height of the interest, the version on the San Jose Mercury News website received 1.3 million hits a day. And according to the Columbia Journalism Review, the series became the most talked about piece of journalism in 1996 and arguably the most famous, and some would say infamous, set of articles of the decade. Webb reported that many African Americans who had never connected to the internet before began using the internet to see the coverage of this story. Webb supported his story with documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, subsequently including a 400-page declassified version of an October 1988 report by the CIA Inspector General Frederick Heitz. According to Webb and his supporters, the evidence demonstrates that the White House officials in the Reagan administration, including Oliver North, knew about and supported using money from drug trafficking to fund the Contras, and they neglected to pass on any information to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. The 1988 report by the Senate Subcommittee on Narcotics, Terrorism, and International Operations on the Committee on Foreign Relations, led then by Senator John Kerry, commented that there were serious questions as to whether or not U.S. officials involved in Central America failed to address the drug issue for fear of jeopardizing the war against Nicaragua. Immediately, denials in the mainstream press appeared. Reports in the Washington Post on October 4th, Los Angeles Times and New York Times on October 21st tried to debunk the link between the Contras and the crack epidemic. Washington Post ombudsman Geneva Overhausler agreed with the critics that her paper's response to the Webb series showed misdirected zeal by Gary Webb and more passion for sniffing out the flaws in the story than for the truth themselves. Gary Webb, later fired from the newspaper, discredited by his own editor for the series that he wrote. His editor said, we stood by the story, but there was holes in it, and this happened in May of the next year. Gary Webb, boy, committed suicide, I think in 2010, in Sacramento, California. They said he committed suicide. They found his body with 2 bullet shots to the head. The coroner, Sacramento coroner, said it was suicide. Such instances are not unheard of. He was a broken man, run out of his profession by the profession he once espoused. If you go up to Wikipedia and Google Gary Webb, there's a little note there from one of his former editors criticizing Gary Webb's work, saying that Gary Webb was not a hero, he was prone to overzealousness, etc., etc. I want to say something in defense posthumously of Gary Webb. Gary never set out to be a hero. He had merely run across a story that he thought the American public should hear and paid for it ultimately with his life. The movie is coming out. I suggest that you might want to see it. Though most movies that are critical of the United States government, the CIA, and the administration and Ronald Reagan never receive much attention. I want to tell you another story that never received any attention. It was a story that came to me. I don't know how many of you have seen the Grand Budapest Hotel. It's a wonderful movie. And it opens up before the story of the hotel is told by an erstwhile writer sitting in front of the microphone with some papers saying that most people think that writers have a plethora of ideas, that they sit down pen to paper and these stories come out as they do. But in the Grand Budapest Hotel, the writer says, this is fiction. Not in the main, but sometimes fiction. Because sometimes stories find the writer because they are a writer. And when the story finds the writer, the person who has the story asks the writer to tell the story that he has. The writer did not think of the story found him. Thus, the grand story of the great Grand Budapest Hotel opens on the big screen. Magnificent movie. I recommend you all see it if you haven't yet. But the third time I saw that movie, those words struck home to me. I turned to my wife, Martha, and I said, that's how Norman's story found me. Norman Bernard Therian was Howard Hughes' banker. And he ended up in a situation where he wanted his story told. And months before, short weeks before, he had met me in federal prison in 1986. And Norman had a story to tell. Norman felt he had been framed by the Reagan White House. He was arrested, I found out later, in Monaco. Extradited illegally to the United States, where he was sentenced to 4 years on trumped-up charges, or Norman so alleged. And Norman had filed an appeal and fully expected this appeal to be granted in his favor. And the day the appeal got turned down, Norman came to me, knowing that I was a writer, and asked a favor, that I write down his story and put it in safekeeping so it could not be reached by anyone. I agreed to do so. I was in the first year of a 10-year prison sentence. I was a hippie drug dealer. What you may have heard about the hippies, some of it is true, most of it is not. But we were an excessive group, I have to admit. And our little altercation with the government, our collective altercation, is finally being unwound here in 2014. The war on drugs had nothing to do with drugs. The most destructive drugs in the United States at the time were tobacco and alcohol. The use of the war on drugs was to go after us, the hippies, who had, I guess, incurred the wrath of those who controlled the United States. And so there I was in Lompoc Federal Prison Camp, where I met Norman Bernard Therian, the banker of Howard Hughes. I met Norman the first week in prison. He didn't tell me, and I had made some sort of oblique remark. For those of you who'd watched this program for the last, I guess, 5 years, ever since it started airing on here in Tucson on a public TV station, I was able to tell stories that can't be told in the media. And certainly the story about Norman has only been told here, first on community TV and later replayed on YouTube stations on the internet. I made the remark when I met Norman, life is sure weird, isn't it? And Norman said, you think it is weird. I was Howard Hughes's banker. This was in November of 1986. I didn't ask Norman about Howard Hughes. That's not my nature. And Norman didn't mention it again. That was not his nature. But in 1986, the Iran-Contra affair was headline news. Allegations that the Republican White House had illegally sold arms in the Middle East to fund an illegal war against the government of Nicaragua and its democratically elected president was just beginning to break. Norman liked me. I like Norman. And for those of you who watch this program, know that I have an uncommon interest in money, especially for being a hippie. And so even then, Norman found me interesting, and we would take many walks around the track in prison, and we would talk about certain things, plans he decided to do, thoughts that he wanted to include me in, projects. Well, the day that Norman's case got turned down, it was a day that he fully expected to be vindicated of the charges that were brought against him. But that led me to hearing a story that Norman never expected to tell. A story I'm going to tell you again today. Norman asked me to go to his cube. In prison, in Lompoc, I call Lompoc the penalty box of the stars. That's got infamous because they had a tennis court there. It got infamous because that's where Ehrlichman and Haldeman were sent, Nixon's aides. You always heard about our tennis court, but the public never heard about the golf course. And by the time I got to prison, to Lompoc, it was only a rumor. And it was only until I was getting out of prison 8 years later, that at a party in Marin County, I ran into some finance guy who had, also an ex-hippie, had done some smuggling and ended up in Lompoc, at the time that Haldeman was there. And he told me about the golf course. It was one hole. It was in the middle of the track. I know that track well. I walked around it many miles. And there was one hole. It was basically made for Haldeman, Nixon's chief aide, for him to go out there keeping practice with his swing. And when Ehrlichman, it wasn't, when Haldeman, it was Haldeman, left prison, finishing his sentence, the golf course was plowed under. Certain things are only meant for the minions of power. But that's how I got confirmation of that golf course. Nonetheless, fate, truly by fate, I ended up to start my 10-year prison sentence at what I used to call Lompoc Federal Prison Camp, the penalty box of the stars. Ivan Boesky, Kevin Mitnick, many people, the names you hear, did time at Lompoc. And that's where I met Norman. Norman took me to his room after I agreed to write a story. And the first thing he did was show me this piece of paper. This is a copy on a prison Xerox machine of what Norman handed to me. And as you can see, it is a letterhead of Transglobal Productions and with a list of the board of directors, and it's a letter addressed to Lord Cranborne, Viscount Lord Cranborne, number 2 Swan Walk, London, England. It is written by the vice president of Transglobal Productions, allegedly a movie production company. And it is a letter of introduction to Lord Cranborne for, as it says here, Bernard Norman Therian, former banker, international banker to Howard Hughes. Norman hands me this paper. The letter was written February 15th, 1983, approximately 3 years earlier. And Norman handed me the paper. I looked at it. And he said, look at the board of directors. Look who's the chairman. And I looked at it. And it reads, Robert E. Cushman, Jr., United States Marine Corps retired. No, it doesn't say that on the list. It just says Robert E. Cushman, U.S. Marine Corps retired. And Norman said, have you heard of Cushman? I said, no. He said, well, not only was he chairman of the board of Transglobal Movie Productions Company and former commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, he was formerly the deputy director of the CIA. Wow. Wow. This is the first piece of paper Norman handed me. There were a number of others. And Norman said, I want to tell you a story. I want you to write it down. And for the next few weeks, Norman and I walked around that track at Lompoc Federal Prison Camp. And he told me the story from his point of view. I had many questions of Norman. Why certain things happen. To some of those questions, Norman had answers. To others, he didn't. But the story was this, that in 1983, Norman was an international banker living in the United States in Monaco and mainly doing oil deals via the Saudi royal family. Before Norman was doing this, he was an employee. He worked for and with Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi arms dealer, of considerable repute. And before he worked with Adnan Khashoggi, he was Howard Hughes's international banker. And before he worked with Howard Hughes, he was the banker to Daniel K. Ludwig. The first year the Forbes 500 came out, Daniel K. Ludwig was the richest man in the world. Norman was his banker. And before he worked with Daniel K. Ludwig, Norman was the banker for Zuckerberg in New York, who ran New York real estate. Norman's financial provenance was rather extraordinary. And it would take him being sentenced to federal prison and my being sentenced to federal prison at the same time for the story to be written down by myself. Like in the Grand Budapest Hotel, the story found me. Norman said that Perry Morgan, the author of this letter of introduction to Viscount Lord Cranborne, had approached him along with another member of the board of Transglobal, Dr. John Speller. Later, many years later, after I got out of prison, the internet didn't exist then, 1986, and it took a few years for me to actually Google the name Dr. John Speller. You could do the same, Jon Speller. I found a reference to Dr. John Speller on the internet along with another one of Transglobal's board members. This time, Rabbi Morton Rosenthal. John Speller and Rabbi Morton Rosenthal were found together in a reference. They were associated with a group who was responsible for the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And the reference said that Morton Rosenthal, a Jewish rabbi and a member of the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish radical group, had a company in South America called Transglobal Resources. Now, if you look at the letterhead of this company that I later found out to be a CIA front company created by Robert E. Cushman, former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps and former Deputy Director of the CIA, called Transglobal Productions, allegedly a movie production company, that two of the board members, Speller and Rosenthal, had a company called Transglobal Resources in South America. But let's get back to the story. Norman said he was approached by these people, and they asked for his help in soliciting money from the Saudis. Now, Norman, as I said, he said at this time he was doing oil deals because he was intimately connected with the Saudi royal family through his association with Adnan Khashoggi. Whereupon he was approached in 1983 by representatives of Transglobal Productions, allegedly a New York movie production company, headed by a former CIA deputy director, to ask the Saudi royal family for money. And then they said what they wanted to do with the money was to establish a fund for the Afghan resistance and to produce a movie written by Perry Morgan, the vice president of Transglobal Movie Productions. Now, I was to find out that Viscount Lord Cranborne was at that time in charge of the UK relief. The story's going to have to wait for the next show. There's going to be another part to this story. Thank you. And I'm continuing on a story I began in my last Dollars and Cents video about Gary Webb, the movie that's coming out about this, basically a hero, one of the many men who have given his life in the service of truth. Edward Snowden is still alive. His story is not yet over. Michael Hastings, the journalist who wrote the story that brought down General McChrystal in Afghanistan, gave his life too. It was set up as a speeding car racing down the middle of the street. The investigation was quashed in Los Angeles. Gary Webb's death ruled as suicide. He had 2 bullet holes in his head. I'm telling a story that was told to me by Howard Hughes' banker. If you're interested in this, go back to the preceding YouTube video and see the intro. I'm going to pick up with this story where I left off. I had met Norman in prison. His appeal gotten turned down. Norman Bernard Therian had been Howard Hughes' banker. And he wanted to tell me a story. I will tell you later what he intended to do with it. It surprised even me. And he showed me, I showed on the other show, the letter. The first thing he showed me was a letter written on the letterhead of Transglobal Productions, allegedly a movie production company in New York. It was basically a CIA front. The chairman of the board was Robert E. Cushman, Jr., United States Commandant, retired, and former deputy director of the CIA. They had approached Norman and wanted his help in soliciting money from the Saudis to help the Afghan resistance. The next piece of paper Norman showed me was this. Where is this? It's not there. All right. I'll have to show it to you here. It is this. I'm going to read what it says because you can't see it. It is written on the letterhead of University of Southern California. Oh, there it is. Now we're back on. This is what it is. University of Southern California. The first letter, which was a letter of introduction, this one, from introducing Norman Bernard Therian to Viscount Lord Cranborne in London. The second letter that Norman showed me was this one. This letter is written on the letterhead of the University of Southern California, and it was written months later in December 15th, 1983. And there's a letter from a professor at USC, Dr. Nate Kamrani, to His Royal Highness Prince Bandar Ibn Sultan, Ambassador of the Royal Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to Washington, D.C. Pursuant to the authorization by His Majesty, the former King of Afghanistan, I am attaching herewith our memorandum, Support for the Afghan Resistance Coalition, for consultation including Budget 1, Budget 2, and a proposal by General Cushman for private American participation. I look forward to hearing from you for the purpose of discussing this memorandum. Your highest personal esteem, I hold you. I remain, sincerely, Nate Kamrani. That was the second piece of paper Norman handed me in prison. I was to meet Nate Kamrani years later under totally different circumstances, though associated with the story that Norman was to tell me. He was still, I believe, a professor at USC. Nonetheless, Norman had met Kamrani. He was introduced to him after he agreed to ask the Saudis for money. He asked Perry Morgan, vice president of Transglobal Movie Production Company, this CIA front, how much money are you going to ask for? And Morgan goes, $500 million. Well, you got to realize that Norman had worked with Howard Hughes. He was used to such vast amounts of money. But the idea that this guy was going to have him ask the Saudi royal family for $500 million was absurd. But Norman was a banker, and as he said, you hear a lot of strange proposals in my profession. So Norman said, well, you know, my fee is 2% of all monies raised. which would have been $10 million. And he didn't expect this story to go anywhere. But it did. The first thing he was introduced to was Nate Kamrani, a professor at USC, I believe in economics. And Norman said Kamrani seemed to him to be genuine. He was an Afghan patriot. He had a little newsletter going on in the mid-'80s, in the early 80s, about the Soviet oppression. They had taken over Kabul, and he was a genuine patriot, and Norman liked him. So as he was talking with Kamrani about how to proceed, Kamrani said, you know, I think we should put together an organization to receive the funds. And he suggested that they get the support of the former king of Afghanistan, Zahir Shah, then living in exile in Paris. And so they sent, Kamrani did, he asked Zahir Shah, a former general in the Afghan army, to go to Paris and ask Zahir Shah if he would head this provisional government. Now, I forgot to bring this piece of paper. You would have loved to have seen it. It was another one of the pieces of paper that Norman gave me. I saw this piece of paper. Norman explained to me what it was. It was illegible. I thought it was written in Afghani. But it was written in English by General Abdul Wali, the aide to the former king of Afghanistan. And so it was a part of the piece of the paper that Norman had given me. I didn't bring it today because I forgot about it. But General Wali went to Paris and talked to the former king, and the king said, listen, I don't want any part of this ruling stuff anymore. All right? He was run out of Afghanistan by the Russians, living in exile in Paris, and wanted to have a quiet life to finish out his life. But he did say, I will head this government on one condition. Before I say I'm going to do it, I want confirmation from the U.S. government that they're going to recognize this organization as the provisional head of Afghanistan. When I get confirmation of that, I'll do it. Well, Abdul Wali comes back from Paris with his news, which he gives to Professor Kamrani and Norman Therian. Norman Therian told me his reaction was, holy smokes, how are we going to get official U.S. recognition of this organization that's not even formed yet? Whereupon Perry Morgan, vice president of Transglobal, says, oh, that's a piece of cake. General Cushman is in the NSA, and NSC, National Security Council. They're tied into the White House. No problem. Whereupon Norman found out it was true. They got a call from the head of the NSC, National Security Council, in the Reagan White House, giving him permission to fly to Rome and arrange a meeting with Wali, the former governor, president, king of Afghanistan, and William Wilson, who at the time was the personal envoy of Ronald Reagan to the Holy See, the Vatican in Rome. Wilson was a Catholic, and so this was one of his little perks in working for his good old friend Ronnie. So Norman said they flew to Rome, and they meet with William Wilson in his offices in the Vatican, and they go to meet the king who's now in Rome for this meeting. And Norman said he was shocked because one of Zahir Shah's conditions for this meeting was that it be very low-key. Zahir Shah was in exile. He wanted very little attention drawn to himself, and only agreed to come out of exile to head this provisional government that was to receive the Saudi funds, that it be very low-key. Norman said they take out of the Vatican with a convoy of 7 limousines and filled with bodyguards to see Zahir Shah. Norman was shocked. This was not the last time that Norman's sensibilities were going to be offended with his relationship with the Reagan White House. At that meeting, Zahir Shah was given the word by William Wilson that this organization did have the support of the United States government. Norman then told me that he wondered why William Wilson kept showing up and asking about what was going on. And Perry Morgan told him in an unguarded moment. William Wilson is going to get $10 million for himself and $10 million for Ronald Reagan's retirement. Now, Norman wasn't shocked by this. Norman was the banker to Howard Hughes, the man who believed that the cheapest way of doing business was to buy the government. Norman told me that the Marina del Rey project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in Los Angeles, that wealthy, wealthy enclave of yachts and buildings, was a Howard Hughes project that he had directed. And Howard Hughes' 50% partner in the project was Herb Kalmbach, President Nixon's personal attorney. Let me assure you, Kalmbach was not included because of his financing acumen. He was in there to buy off Richard Nixon. And he did. Well, Norman says he asked the Saudi king for the $500 million, as he was requested to do by Transglobal. The Saudi king agreed to do it. This letter, written by Nate Kamrani to Prince Bandar, was about that request. They were about to present it in person in Washington, D.C. at the Hayes Adam Hotel. And you can see, if you can read it, that it has proposals for a budget, including a memorandum by General Cushman for private American participation. I want you to remember that. Private American participation by General Cushman. I asked Norman, why did they come to you for the money? Norman said he didn't know. He just told me the circumstances. I said, Norman, these people were at the highest echelons of the U.S. government. CIA, the White House. All they had to do was pick up the phone, identify themselves, and make the request. But no, they approached you, and not even directly. They approached you through a front organization, a fake movie production company called Transglobal Productions, to approach the Saudis for the money. These people, the most powerful people in the government, put together a little front company, sent Perry Morgan and his sidekick, John Speller, over to see you to ask you to phone the Saudis, who they knew, you knew, because of circumstances I will tell you later. And Norman did. The Saudis said they'd put up the money, and that's it. I said, why did they do this? Norman said he didn't know. And I thought about it. Here I was, a hippie drug dealer in prison, but I had gone to law school, at least for 1 year before I took LSD and dropped out in San Francisco. And I don't regret it, folks. I learned a lot more in the Haight-Ashbury and LSD than I would about torts, procedure, law, and the corrupt American system that it represents. I thought about it. And I thought, why would they do this? Why would they put up a front company and approach a private banker to approach the Saudis? And you know what? The answer came to me. The Reagan White House was much enamored of the idea of privatization. Remember that? Privatization? Let's privatize government? Well, General Richard Secord, told the House committee that he had sold the weapons in the Middle East and was assured by White House counsel, Edwin Meese, that it would be legitimate because he was doing it as a private citizen, not as a U.S. government official. They thought that privatization would give them legal cover to solicit funds from the Saudi government and embezzle some of that money for their own use if it was done privately. Privately. I look forward to hearing from you for the purpose of discussing this memorandum, which includes a proposal by General Cushman for private American participation. December 1983. Professor Nate Kamrani to Prince Bandar. If you're curious about this, you might want to Google Prince Bandar in Wikipedia. I don't know if they've let him out of his cage, but he disappeared for approximately 2 years because of rumors of a coup against the king of Saudi Arabia. At that time, he was the ambassador of the royal kingdom to the United States in 1983. This began unraveling on Norman's behalf. He had heard the money had been transferred, but General Cushman, Norman told me General Cushman called him up and wanted to let Norman in on a little part of the deal that Transglobal had going. And he told Norman this. This was in the mid-1980s. And Cushman said to Norman, we're going to make some more money in this. I think he wanted to brag to Howard Hughes' banker. I mean, Cushman was a Marine. He wasn't a financier. And that's why he told this, what I'm going to tell you, to Norman Therian, who he knew was Howard Hughes' banker. He wanted to show him how they were going to make some money. He said, what we're going to do is, we have, through Rabbi Morton Rosenthal, who's on the board of Transglobal, arranged to purchase the captured Syrian arms that Israel has, they captured after the Six-Day War. The Israelis had warehouses of weapons that the Syrian army had dropped and fled after their aborted attempt to invade Israel. And the Israelis had this. So what Transglobal was going to do, Cushman said, we're going to buy these armaments, unused armaments, from the Israelis at pennies on the dollar and sell them at a higher price to the Afghan resistance, who were soliciting the money for. He was bragging to Norman. Norman's reaction was not what Cushman expected. Norman exploded. He said, you're going to do what? God damn it! Holy hell is going to break loose if the Saudis find out what we've done with their money. Norman had brought the Saudis to the table. They were Norman's clients in this deal. And Norman knew. He felt that the Saudis found out that a deal that he had led them into, money was going to be taken from and used to buy Syrian arms from the Israelis. The Saudis were going to have the proverbial cow. Cushman, Norman said, backed off. And he apologized. He said, well, Norman, he said, you're right. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Thank you. Promise not to do it. Well, what happened was this. Norman was kicked out of the deal. His former oil partner, Ronald Soblosky, showed up later with another letter. No, I don't have that letter here. No, I didn't bring that letter. I didn't bring that letter. But it's in my book, if you want to see it. I have this book here, Light in a Dark Place. All right? The Prison Years by Darryl Robert Schoon. The whole story of Norman Bernard Therian is in this book, and are the documents. It is a letter, personal letter addressed to Norman by General Robert E. Cushman with his address in Washington, D.C., his signature informing Norman that he's no longer the financial representative of Transglobal, that Ronald Soblosky is going to be taking this deal over. Norman said Ronald Soblosky was his old partner in his oil deals with the Saudis, and he found out from Ronald that he is Perry Morgan's half-brother. That's how Transglobal knew of his connections with the Saudis. That's how the deal got cooked up. Ronald Soblosky, John Speller, Morton Rosenthal, Perry Morgan, General Robert E. Cushman, William Wilson, and others were members of a conspiracy designed to defraud the United States government and the Saudi government of millions of dollars, ostensibly to raise money for the Afghan resistance, and the money never reached them. When Cushman found out that Norman had lost his temper when he realized it. He felt that Norman couldn't be trusted. Norman was indicted the next year, living in Monaco, on what Norman said were trumped-up charges on loan fees, extradited back to the United States to be discredited and sent to federal prison, where he met me. This was 1986. Now I'm in prison. This story is told to me. I don't know if it's true, except fate was kind. Fate was very kind. What is here is this. I don't know if you can read it. It says, CIA arms account was also used by Saudi Arabia. This is in the LA Times, December 4th, 1986, Part 1. What the story says is the Iran-Contra money was found, discovered in a CIA secret Swiss account in Switzerland, commingled with $500 million. The account in question, government sources said Wednesday, included $250 million in deposits from both the United States and Saudi Arabia that are used to buy Soviet bloc weapons for distribution to the resistance forces battling the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. When I read that, I thought, wow, the $500 million, according to Norman, came all from Saudi Arabia. And the article said it was $250 million from Saudi Arabia and $250 million from the United States. And the question crossed my mind was this: did the Reagan White House substitute $250 million of the Saudi funds with $250 million of U.S. government funds and steal that for their own use, Ronald Reagan's retirement, and for those insiders in the Reagan White House and perhaps the Republican Party itself? Those were questions that passed my mind. Norman, and I tell the story in my book, Light in a Dark Place, that once this was written down, Norman asked to see a lawyer. He wrote a lawyer threatening to divulge this story. Two people, the lawyer came, very high-ranking lawyer from the Republican Party, along with a relative of Orrin Hatch, the ranking senator from Utah, and another relative of Paul Laxalt, the ranking senator from Nevada, to come to Norman to hear the story. They knew from the lawyer that Norman was Howard Hughes' former banker. Norman said, I'm going to, let it be known that unless they got him out of prison, the story was going to make the news, that it was in the hands of a third party, who was me. And what happened is, they got word from William Wilson in the White House a few months later, let him tell the story. No one will believe him. And I want to tell you something. Maybe they would have believed him, maybe they would not have. But that story was never going to make the news. I had that story. I have the papers. I have the documentation. I approached Bob Woodard of the Washington Post, the one who broke the Watergate story. I approached A&E, Bill Curtis, the investigative reports. I sent this story to the LA Times. No response. In 2006, I actually met Nate Kamrani, professor at USC. My friend Marshall Thurber's son, Rawson Marshall Thurber, had just written and directed a movie called Dodgeball in Los Angeles. And I called up Kamrani. He asked if I knew anybody in the movie business. We met that night at the premiere for Dodgeball, and he confirmed the story. My side of it. He didn't know about the skim. He knew about the private participation. The truth will out.